Are you unknowingly draining wealth from your own life? Today we're diving deep into something I call the wealth vampire syndrome, and trust me, this isn't about some mystical creature lurking in the shadows. This is about very real biblical principles that reveal how we might be sucking the life out of our own financial future without even realizing it. Let me start with a story that might sound familiar. Sarah works 60 hours a week at a job she despises. Every Sunday night, she feels that familiar knot in her stomach knowing Monday is coming. She complains constantly about her boss, her coworkers, and how unfair everything is. Despite making decent money, she's always broke. She buys things to make herself feel better about her miserable work situation, then worries about money, which makes her more miserable, which makes her spend more. It's a vicious cycle. What Sarah doesn't realize is that she's become a wealth vampire, draining her own financial energy through patterns that go against fundamental biblical wisdom. And here's the kicker: the Bible has been warning us about these wealth-draining behaviors for thousands of years. The first sign you might be a wealth vampire is if you're constantly complaining about your financial situation while doing nothing to change it. Proverbs 14 verse 23 tells us that in all labor there is profit, but idle chatter leads only to poverty. Notice it doesn't say some labor or the right kind of labor. It says in all labor there is profit. But here's where most people miss the point. They think this verse is just about working hard. It's actually about the mindset behind the work. When you constantly complain about your job, your boss, your circumstances, you're engaging in what the Bible calls idle chatter. You're spending mental and emotional energy on words that produce nothing except more negativity. Think about it this way. Every minute you spend complaining about your financial situation is a minute you're not spending figuring out how to improve it. Every conversation where you rehash how unfair your boss is or how impossible it is to get ahead is energy that could be directed toward learning a new skill, building a side business, or networking with people who could help advance your career. The wealth vampire mindset says I'll be happy when my circumstances change. The biblical wealth mindset says I'll change my circumstances by changing my approach. There's a massive difference between these two perspectives, and it shows up in your bank account. The second wealth vampire behavior is what I call financial procrastination disguised as spirituality. You've probably heard people say things like God will provide or I'm trusting God with my finances while simultaneously making terrible financial decisions and refusing to take responsibility for their money management. Don't get me wrong. God absolutely will provide, and we should trust Him with our finances. But the Bible is crystal clear that faith without works is dead. James chapter 2 verse 26 says that faith without deeds is useless. When it comes to money, this means that trusting God includes being a good steward of what He's already given you. Here's a hard truth: if you're not budgeting, not tracking your expenses, not planning for the future, and not educating yourself about money management, you're not trusting God with your finances. You're being lazy and calling it faith. That's not biblical. That's being a wealth vampire. The parable of the talents in Matthew 25 is one of the clearest examples of this principle. The master gives each servant different amounts of money to manage while he's away. 2 of the servants invest and multiply what they're given. 1 buries his money in the ground because he's afraid of losing it. When the master returns, he's furious with the servant who buried the money. He calls him wicked and lazy. Notice he doesn't call him faithful or trusting. He calls him lazy. The servant's fear and inaction were not virtues. They were failures of stewardship. If you're avoiding learning about investing because you think it's too risky or too worldly, you might be the servant burying your talent in the ground. If you're not planning for retirement because you believe Jesus is coming back soon, you're making the same mistake. Even if Jesus returns tomorrow, good stewardship is still a biblical command for today. The third wealth vampire trait is living in constant financial fear while claiming to trust God. Fear is one of the biggest wealth drains in existence, and it shows up in countless ways. Fear keeps you in a job you hate because you're afraid you won't find something better. Fear keeps you from investing because you might lose money. Fear keeps you from starting a business because it might fail. But here's what the Bible says about fear. 2 Timothy 1:7 tells us that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and sound judgment. When you make financial decisions from a place of fear, you're not operating in the spirit God gave you. You're operating as a wealth vampire, draining your own potential. Fear-based financial decisions almost always cost more in the long run. The person who's afraid to invest keeps all their money in savings accounts earning 1% while inflation eats away at their purchasing power. The person who's afraid to leave their terrible job stays there for 20 years, missing opportunities for career growth and higher income. The person who's afraid to start a business works for someone else their entire life, building wealth for others instead of themselves. Sound judgment, which the Bible mentions as the alternative to fear, requires education, planning, and calculated risks. It means learning about different investment options and choosing ones that match your risk tolerance and timeline. It means building an emergency fund so you have the freedom to make career moves when opportunities arise. It means starting that business with proper planning and enough savings to survive the startup phase. The fourth sign you're a wealth vampire is if you're constantly comparing your financial situation to others and feeling either superior or inferior based on those comparisons. Social media has made this problem exponentially worse. You see someone's vacation photos and feel bad about your own financial situation. You see someone struggling and feel smug about your own stability. Both responses are wealth draining because they take your focus off your own financial growth and put it on other people's circumstances. The Bible warns against this in 2 Corinthians 10:12, saying that those who compare themselves with others are not wise. Here's why comparison is such a wealth vampire behavior. When you feel inferior to others financially, you often make poor spending decisions trying to keep up appearances. You buy things you can't afford to look successful. When you feel superior to others financially, you often become complacent and stop growing. You think you're doing well enough and stop pushing yourself to improve. The biblical approach is to run your own race. Focus on being a better steward today than you were yesterday. Focus on growing your income, reducing your expenses, and increasing your giving compared to your own past performance, not compared to what others are doing. The fifth wealth vampire behavior is using generosity as an excuse for poor financial planning. This might sound counterintuitive because the Bible clearly teaches us to be generous. But there's a difference between biblical generosity and financial irresponsibility disguised as generosity. Biblical generosity comes from abundance and planning. It's intentional and sustainable. Financial irresponsibility disguised as generosity is impulsive and often leaves you unable to help others when they really need it. If you're constantly broke because you give away money you don't have, you're not being generous. You're being a wealth vampire. The Bible teaches us to give proportionally and regularly. 1 Corinthians 16:2 tells us to set aside a sum of money in keeping with our income. This implies planning and budgeting for generosity, not impulsive giving that puts your own financial stability at risk. Think about it practically. If you give away money you needed for your electric bill, and then your power gets shut off, have you really helped anyone? If you lend money you don't have to someone who never pays you back, and then you can't help your own family member who has a genuine emergency, was that wise stewardship? True biblical generosity requires you to first be financially stable yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup. This means building an emergency fund, paying off high-interest debt, and having a solid financial foundation before you start giving large amounts to others. The sixth wealth vampire trait is believing that money is inherently evil or that being wealthy is somehow unspiritual. This belief system will drain your wealth faster than almost anything else because it creates internal conflict about financial success. Part of you wants to improve your financial situation, but part of you believes that wanting more money makes you greedy or worldly. Let's clear this up with what the Bible actually says. 1 Timothy 6:10 tells us that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, not that money itself is evil. There's a huge difference between these two concepts. Money is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used for good or evil depending on the person using it. The Bible is full of wealthy people who were blessed by God and used their wealth for good purposes. Abraham was extremely wealthy. Job was the richest man in his region. David accumulated massive wealth to build the temple. Solomon's wealth was legendary. These men weren't condemned for their wealth. They were blessed because of their faithfulness and used their resources to serve God and help others. The problem isn't having money. The problem is loving money more than God, or pursuing money through unethical means, or being stingy with money when others are in need. If you have the right heart attitude, wealth actually increases your ability to serve God and help others. When you believe that money is evil or that poverty is more spiritual than wealth, you sabotage your own financial success. You feel guilty about earning more, so you don't pursue promotions or better opportunities. You feel uncomfortable with success, so you unconsciously make decisions that keep you struggling financially. The seventh and perhaps most dangerous wealth vampire behavior is waiting for someone else to fix your financial problems. This shows up as waiting for a raise, waiting for an inheritance, waiting for the government to forgive your student loans, waiting for your spouse to get a better job, waiting for the economy to improve. While you're waiting for external circumstances to change, you're not taking action to improve your own situation. The Bible teaches personal responsibility and proactive behavior when it comes to financial stewardship. Proverbs 6:6-8 tells us to consider the ant, which works hard during harvest time to prepare for winter, even though no one is forcing it to do so. The ant doesn't wait for someone else to provide for winter. It takes personal responsibility for its own survival and works diligently while resources are available. This is the biblical model for financial stewardship. You don't wait for perfect circumstances or for someone else to solve your problems. You work with what you have, where you are, right now. This means if you're underpaid, you start looking for better opportunities or developing skills that command higher wages. If you're in debt, you create a plan to pay it off instead of hoping it will somehow disappear. If you're not saving for retirement, you start now with whatever amount you can afford, even if it's small. The final wealth vampire behavior I want to address is spiritual bypassing when it comes to money management. This is when you use spiritual concepts to avoid dealing with practical financial realities. You might say things like, "I don't worry about money because God owns everything," or "money isn't important, relationships are what matter," or "I'm storing up treasures in heaven, not on earth." All of these statements contain biblical truth, but when used to avoid financial responsibility, they become wealth vampire behaviors. Yes, God owns everything, but He's made you a steward of the resources He's placed in your care. Yes, relationships matter more than money, but money problems can destroy relationships and limit your ability to serve others. Yes, we should store up treasures in heaven, but Jesus also taught practical principles for managing earthly resources. The Bible doesn't separate spiritual and practical matters the way we often do. It gives practical advice about earning, saving, spending, and giving money because these are spiritual issues. How you handle money reveals your character, your priorities, and your level of spiritual maturity. So how do you stop being a wealth vampire and start building biblical wealth? First, take complete responsibility for your current financial situation. Stop blaming your boss, your spouse, the economy, or your circumstances. Even if external factors contributed to your problems, you're the only one who can solve them. Second, educate yourself about money management and biblical financial principles. Read books, take courses, listen to podcasts, attend seminars. The Bible says that people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Don't let financial ignorance destroy your future. Third, create a written plan for your money. Budget your income, track your expenses, set financial goals, and monitor your progress regularly. A goal without a plan is just a wish, and hope is not a financial strategy. Fourth, start where you are with what you have. Don't wait until you earn more money to start managing money well. If you can't manage $1,000 responsibly, you won't manage $10,000 responsibly either. Faithfulness in little things leads to faithfulness in big things. Finally, remember that building wealth is not about getting rich quick or achieving financial independence so you never have to work again. Biblical wealth building is about becoming a faithful steward who can provide for your family, be generous to others, and advance God's kingdom on earth. It's about using money as a tool to accomplish God's purposes in your life and in the world. Stop draining your own financial future with wealth vampire behaviors. Start building the abundant life God intended for you by following His principles for money management. Your future self will thank you, and more importantly, you'll be positioned to make a greater impact for God's kingdom through faithful stewardship of the resources He's entrusted to your care.